December 5th, 1975, a Friday night in Manor Township, Pennsylvania. Snow drifts quietly down over Barbara Street, blanketing the neighborhood in a false sense of peace. Christmas lights twinkle on porches. Families gather for dinner. The kind of quiet small-town evening where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Inside a modest apartment, 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beckler sets down a cup of tea, straightens her couch pillows, and thinks about the weekend ahead. She doesn't know that, just outside her door, something unthinkable waits. Minutes later, the sound of a struggle. A lamp crashes. A scream cut short. And then, silence. When police arrive, the snow outside her window has turned pink. Lindy Sue lies on the floor, stabbed 19 times with her own kitchen knife, the wooden handle wrapped neatly in a tea towel, as if the killer had thought about fingerprints. The violence is surgical, deliberate, intimate. Whoever did this didn't just want her dead. They wanted her erased. Her small apartment, once warm and ordinary, is now a frozen crime scene, blood on the walls, overturned furniture, the faint scent of iron in the winter air. Outside, neighbors watch in horror as flashing red and blue lights shatter the night. The killer? Gone without a trace. For 47 years, her murder haunted this Pennsylvania town, one of the most disturbing mysteries in the archives of cold case files. Evidence preserved, families broken, detectives obsessed. And then, decades later, a discarded coffee cup would finally reveal the monster who had lived among them all along. You think you know your neighbors? You think your street is safe. But what if the killer next door smiled at you every morning for 47 years, and you never knew? Stay with us, because this is one of the most haunting cold case files ever solved. Snowflakes floated lazily over Manor Township, painting the quiet streets in pale silver. On Barbara Street, a faint glow from apartment 312 cut through the falling snow. Inside, Lindy Sue Beckler moved through her small living room, humming softly to the radio. It was December 5th, 1975, the kind of evening that seemed designed for comfort. Tea steeping on the counter, a paperback novel left open on the armrest, a knitted blanket draped over the couch. 19 years old, she was young enough to dream and old enough to believe that tomorrow would be better than today. She had spent the day working at the Lancaster County Social Services office, helping struggling families fill out paperwork before the holidays. Her co-workers adored her for her quiet optimism and kindness. Earlier that afternoon, she'd promised her sister Susan they'd go Christmas shopping that weekend. Lindy had even written a note on her fridge. Pick up wrapping paper. 8s. Everything about her life seemed steady, ordinary, the kind of life you expect to continue unchanged. But evil doesn't announce itself. It waits for the perfect silence. Sometime after 7 p.m., neighbors later recalled, a faint thump echoed through the hallway of the apartment building. Mrs. Helen Wagner downstairs assumed Lindy had dropped something. Then came a muffled crash, a lamp, maybe, and what might have been a scream quickly swallowed by the walls. The sounds stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Mrs. Wagner turned down her television, hesitated, then told herself not to be paranoid. In a town like Manor Township, you didn't call the police because someone bumped furniture. Upstairs, Lindy's front door had been forced. Scratches marked the lock. Whoever entered didn't knock. There was a brief struggle near the entryway, an overturned chair, a broken lampshade, a scattering of magazines. Blood droplets began near the couch and trailed toward the kitchen. The attack came fast, brutal, deliberate. The killer grabbed one of Lindy's own knives, a standard 8-inch kitchen blade, and drove it into her body again and again, 19 times in total. Most wounds struck her chest and neck, one piercing deep enough to lodge the knife itself. Before leaving, the assailant wrapped a tea towel carefully around the handle, almost ritualistically, as if cleansing guilt with cloth. Outside, snow continued to fall. Cars passed. Nothing seemed unusual. In small-town America, people trusted that horror belonged somewhere else, the city, the headlines, not Barbara Street. When Lindy failed to answer her parents' evening call, her mother assumed she'd gone out. It wasn't until 10 p.m. that concern turned to fear. Robert and Margaret Beckler drove to her apartment, lights from their old Ford reflecting against icy windows. They knocked. No answer. Through the glass pane, the glow of the living room lamp flickered over disarray. Margaret whispered her daughter's name, once, twice. Robert pushed the door. It gave way. What they saw would never leave them. Lindy lay near the kitchen entrance, her hair fanned across the tile, eyes half open. Blood had pooled around her, darkening the linoleum. The metallic scent hit first, then the silence, a silence so heavy it felt alive. Robert pulled his wife back into the hallway and called for help, his voice breaking through the still night. At 10:17 p.m. Officer Michael Patterson arrived, his breath turning white in the cold. A 15-year veteran, he'd seen crashes, suicides, domestic fights, but never this. The warmth of the apartment mixed with the odor of copper. His flashlight beams swept across the room. Overturned furniture, bloody footprints, drag marks. He froze when the light landed on the knife protruding from Lindy's neck. The towel wrapped around its handle wasn't random. It was precise, calculated. Whoever had done this understood evidence. Patterson stepped outside for air, gulping the freezing wind to steady himself. Then he went back in. Protocol demanded professionalism. Humanity demanded compassion. He crouched beside the young woman and whispered, almost apologetically, "We'll find who did this." Eights. Detective Sergeant Robert Hayes arrived 20 minutes later, coat collar pulled high against the snow. His expression hardened as he surveyed the scene. He'd handled robberies, assaults, even a homicide once, but nothing like this. 19 stab wounds spoke of rage, but the towel around the handle whispered intelligence. Rage and control rarely coexist, yet both lingered here. Crime scene technicians moved methodically through the apartment, dusting surfaces, photographing everything. They collected fibers, hair strands, fingerprints from the doorknob and windowsills. Under ultraviolet light, faint traces of blood led from the living room toward the bathroom. The killer may have washed his hands before leaving. On the bedroom floor, investigators found a single torn button, likely from the attacker's clothing. When the medical examiner arrived, the small apartment felt crowded with professionals, each whispering notes into tape recorders. Outside, yellow tape fluttered under the streetlight, slicing through the gentle snowfall. Neighbors gathered behind their curtains, faces pale and wordless. The police radios crackled with routine language that felt obscene against the backdrop of tragedy. One deceased female, age 19. Eights. Inside the coroner's van, Lindy's body was covered, zipped, and wheeled away. The sound of the metal gurney wheels on ice echoed through the quiet street like an accusation. By midnight, word had spread. Mrs. Wagner stood at her window, clutching a robe to her chest, whispering, "I heard something. I should have called." Guilt already tightening its grip. Down at the station, Hayes began assembling his first night notes. Forced entry. Knife from the victim's kitchen. Signs of struggle. Possible sexual assault. Motive unclear. He looked at the list and felt the weight of something larger, not just a murder, but the destruction of an illusion. Manor Township's innocence had bled out onto a kitchen floor. The next morning, the local paper printed a single headline. Eights. Young woman slain in her apartment. Police seek clues. By sunrise, television vans rolled in. Reporters in heavy coats spoke of a shocking crime in a peaceful community. For the first time, Barbara Street became a boundary between the world before the murder and everything that came after. Lindy's friends arrived at the scene, their eyes red, clutching flowers in disbelief. Her best friend Karen Hutchinson kept repeating, "She was supposed to call me. She was supposed to call." Eights. Inside the police department, officers studied evidence photos. Each image captured fragments of horror: the towel-wrapped knife, defensive wounds on Lindy's hands, drops of blood shaped like question marks. Hayes stared longest at a single picture. Lindy's refrigerator note. Pick up wrapping paper. Ordinary words turned heartbreaking. Patterson would later tell colleagues that night changed him. "You spend years thinking this job makes you tough," he said, "but then you see something like that, and you realize toughness doesn't mean a damn thing." Eights. Over the following days, the crime scene became legend. Parents warned their daughters to keep doors locked. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion. In a town of 4, Izuwazaro, everyone knew everyone, and that meant everyone could imagine themselves in Lindy's place. At night, Barbara Street fell eerily silent. Porch lights stayed on until dawn. Children were kept indoors. Mrs. Wagner barely slept, haunted by the sound she hadn't reported. She told police later, voice trembling, "If I'd called, maybe she'd still be alive." Eights. The police canvassed every door, every neighbor. They asked about strangers, repairmen, ex-boyfriends, delivery drivers. But deep down, Hayes already feared the worst, that this killer wasn't a drifter or stranger. The calculated method, the local familiarity, it all hinted at someone close. Someone who knew this town's rhythm, who blended in perfectly. As the first week passed, Christmas decorations still glowed along the streets, but no one felt festive. The scent of pine mixed with unease. At every creak of an apartment door, every unknown car on the block made hearts race. The community's heartbeat had changed. It now pulsed with fear. For the Beckler family, time fractured. Their home, once filled with laughter, became a shrine of photographs and unanswered questions. Robert sat in his recliner each night staring at Lindy's high school portrait. Margaret couldn't step into her daughter's room without shaking. Susan, only 17, slept with the light on. Meanwhile, Detective Hayes worked 12-hour shifts, determined not to let the case slip into darkness. He reviewed notes, diagrams, interviews, over and over, searching for something he'd missed. But the killer had left almost nothing, just silence and devastation. The night of December 5th would live forever in Manor Township's collective memory, the night innocence died. Snow still fell, but it no longer looked pure. Underneath it lay blood, fear, and a question that echoed through every home. Eights. If this could happen here, to someone like Lindy Sue Beckler, what about the rest of us? The town didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning, the first chapter in one of Pennsylvania's most haunting cold case files. Morning light broke cold and gray over Barbara Street. The snow had crusted into ice, preserving the footprints of first responders like fossilized memories. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, whispering against the metal railing of the stairwell that led to apartment number 12, the apartment that had turned a quiet town into a headline. Inside, the air was still heavy with the metallic tang of blood and disinfectant. Detective Robert Hayes stepped carefully across the threshold, his breath fogging in the cold air that seeped through the cracked window. Behind him followed Detective Patricia Reynolds, one of the few women in the Lancaster County Department at the time, sharp-eyed, steady-voiced, and unafraid to ask questions others avoided. Hayes spoke first. "Start from the entry point," he said, his tone clipped but weary. Reynolds nodded, already snapping on latex gloves as a crime scene technician adjusted the flashbulb on his Polaroid. Each burst of light froze the horror in fragments: the overturned chair, the broken lamp, the streaks of blood running down the wall like a grotesque signature. Every item went into evidence bags. Fibers from the couch, a cigarette butt near the kitchen trash, the torn button found on the floor. A forensic officer called out numbers as Reynolds labeled each bag with a thick black marker. Item 14, kitchen towel, found wrapped around knife handle. Click. Another Polaroid flash. Item 15, partial fingerprint on countertop. Click. In the hallway, the camera's flash spilled under the door, startling the neighbors who huddled together in silence. Word had already spread. The Beckler girls been murdered. Every face looked pale, every glance wary. By mid-morning, the living room looked less like a home and more like a laboratory. The coroner's team had finished their sweep, but Hayes lingered. He stared at the blood spatter pattern near the wall, droplets angled upward, suggesting Lindy had been standing when the first blow struck. He knelt, tracing the faint outline of a shoe print beside the stain. A man's size, maybe 11. Reynolds crouched next to him. "Whoever did this wasn't panicking," she said quietly. "Look at the precision. He knew how to avoid prints." "Eights." Hayes nodded. He wrapped the handle. Thought ahead. "That's not impulse. That's control." Eights. Control. The word hung in the air like a chill. Downstairs, they began knocking on doors. The first stop, Mrs. Helen Wagner, the woman who had heard the noise but said nothing. She stood in her doorway, trembling hands clutching a tissue, her robe cinched tight. I didn't know it was something bad," she said through tears. "I heard a crash, maybe a shout. I thought it was her TV. God help me. I should have called." Eights. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling, as if she could still hear the echoes. It was around 7:30, maybe closer to 7:45. Eights. Reynolds took notes while Hayes studied her face, not out of suspicion, but recognition. Guilt leaves marks deeper than bruises. "You couldn't have known," he said softly, but even as he spoke, Mrs. Wagner's expression told him she'd never forgive herself. Next, they interviewed the tenant across the hall, Mr. Franklin, a retired postal worker who had heard some banging, maybe furniture moving. He hadn't seen anyone enter or leave. No strange cars, no raised voices, nothing. By noon, the detectives had canvassed the entire building, 10 apartments, 10 interviews, and still no solid lead. Everyone had heard something slightly different. A thud, a cry, silence. The story blurred like breath on glass. At the precinct, Hayes pinned a map of the complex to the wall and began marking statements with red strings. Reynolds sorted photographs into categories: entry, struggle, weapon, biological evidence. The board grew crowded, the story tangled. Then came the report from the medical examiner. 19 stab wounds, varying depths. Evidence of sexual assault. skin tissue under the victim's fingernails. "She fought," Reynolds whispered. "She tried to fight him off." "Eights!" Hayes clenched his jaw. "Good. Maybe she left him something to find." Eights. They logged every scrap of evidence into the official ledger: the towel, the knife, the torn button, the cigarette, the blood samples. Reynolds sealed each envelope with tape-stamped "Property of Manor Township Police." Hayes made one final note in his logbook before locking the files away for the night. Eights. Suspect unknown. Possible local connection. Crime appears both personal and deliberate. Eights. Outside, dusk fell over the town again. Reporters still lingered near the barricades, their breath freezing in the air as they speculated about motives. Robbery? Lovers' quarrel? They asked, hungry for answers that didn't exist. But for Hayes and Reynolds, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the image that wouldn't leave them, the towel wrapped with care, the quiet aftermath of unimaginable rage. Manor Township would never feel safe again. And though they didn't know it yet, the two detectives had just stepped into a case that would haunt them, a case destined to become one of the most haunting cold case files in Pennsylvania history. By the time the evening news aired that night, Manor Township had already begun to unravel. The murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beckler wasn't just another crime. It was an infection that spread through every street, every whispered conversation, every shadow that lingered too long on a porch. The day after the killing, the hardware store on Main Street reported a record-breaking rush. Owner Bill Morrison later told reporters, "I sold out of every deadbolt and window lock by noon. Folks were buying 2 at a time. Nobody trusts their doors anymore." Eights. For years, the people of Manor Township had slept with windows open and screen doors unlatched. Now, every creak in the night was a threat. Parents forbade their daughters from walking alone after sunset. Teenagers who once gathered at the diner on Fridays now met in small groups at home, glancing at the dark windows as if the killer might be outside, listening. Church attendance soared that winter. Fear had become a kind of religion. Pastor Muller's sermons shifted from comfort to warning. Evil doesn't always wear a stranger's face. Eights. Detectives Hayes and Reynolds spoke to local media, urging calm, but their words only deepened the unease. The investigation had no suspect, no motive, no direction, only a growing dread that whoever had done this was still close. "We believe the killer may have been familiar with the area," Hayes admitted at a press conference. That sentence echoed across living rooms like a curse. The town's small police department installed extra patrols, but fear was something no squad car could contain. Grocery stores closed early. Holiday parades were canceled. "We just couldn't pretend it was Christmas anymore," recalled one shop owner. As weeks turned into months, the snow melted, but the anxiety didn't. People still crossed the street rather than pass strangers. Even decades later, residents would describe that winter as the time when everything changed. Eights. And somewhere, in that uneasy silence, the killer watched it all. The years that followed were long and heavy. The Beckler family lived inside their grief like it was a second house, one they could never move out of. The framed photos of Lindy remained on the mantel, her smile frozen in graduation day sunlight. Her room stayed untouched, the way she left it. The perfume bottle half full, the sweater folded neatly at the foot of her bed. Robert Beckler, her father, returned to work at the paper mill, but spoke little. He'd once been the kind of man who greeted everyone by name. Now his voice was quieter, his shoulders permanently slumped. In his mind, the world had broken some unspoken contract, the promise that decency was enough to keep your children safe. Margaret, her mother, found religion but not peace. Every December, she decorated the Christmas tree alone, hanging Lindy's childhood ornaments with trembling hands. "I keep thinking she's just late coming home," she once told a neighbor. And David Beckler, Lindy's older brother, turned his sorrow into obsession. He visited the police station every few months, asking for updates, volunteering to help. He marked the anniversary of her death with handwritten letters addressed simply to "my sister." Letters he never mailed. Each December 5th, the family gathered at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church for a memorial service. Attendance dwindled each year, but the pain never did. Candles lined the altar, their flames trembling like fragile hope. Pastor Muller's voice would echo softly through the sanctuary. "Justice may rest, but it never sleeps." 8. Detective Hayes retired in 1979, handing the case file to a younger investigator. His once sharp notes had turned into weary reflections. Still no suspect. One page read. Still no peace. Reynolds transferred out of homicide the next year, unable to stomach the sight of another body. Before she left, she visited the Becklers one last time, promising Margaret she'd never forget Lindy's face. But time is cruel. By the mid-1980s, the murder had faded from headlines and settled into legend, the cautionary tale parents told their children when they forgot to lock the door. Yet behind that fading memory, the pain never truly vanished. It simply changed form, from grief to resignation, from fear to numbness. For the Becklers, every snowfall felt like that night returning. For the detectives, the unsolved case became a ghost on the edge of every new investigation. And for the killer, whoever he was, life went on, quietly, invisibly, while the rest of Manor Township learned to live with the unthinkable. The file was labeled "Open Unsolved" and tucked away in the evidence room. But among the thousands of unsolved murders in America, Lindy's name would remain one of the most haunting entries in the archives of cold case files. By the time the 1990s arrived, Manor Township had changed, but the scar remained. The town had grown, houses repainted, children turned into parents, yet the mention of Lindy Sue Beckler's name could still quiet a room. Her murder had faded from the headlines, but not from memory. The file labeled Beckler Homicide, 1975, sat buried in a metal cabinet in the Lancaster County evidence vault. Yellowed papers, Polaroids sealed in plastic sleeves, and a few small vials marked biological sample. 8. Detective Mark Stevens was the one who reopened it. A younger investigator than Hayes, with a reputation for detail, Stevens had joined the department in the late 80s, a generation raised on forensic thrillers and emerging science. When he first flipped through the file, he found the same despairing notes that had haunted his predecessors. No suspect. No motive. No prints. But what caught his attention was Hayes' final entry before retirement. 8. Preserve everything. Someday science will tell us what we can't yet see. 8. At the time, Hayes wrote that DNA analysis was little more than a theory, something whispered about in forensic conferences and university labs. But by 1990, that theory had become real. Across the country, police departments were beginning to use genetic evidence to solve crimes once thought unsolvable. Tiny traces of blood, saliva, or hair could now speak louder than any witness. Stevens requested permission to revisit Lindy's case, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a test of what this new science could do. The Lancaster County District Attorney's Office approved the move. They formed a small cold case unit, staffed by a handful of detectives, a forensic analyst, and one aging evidence clerk who remembered the case from her first year on the job. Together, They opened the sealed boxes like archaeologists unearthing a tragedy. Inside were manila folders labeled with typewriter ink, every item tagged in meticulous handwriting. The knife, the towel, the button, and most crucially, a sealed envelope marked biological sample, do not destroy. 8s. Inside that envelope lay what investigators from 1975 could never have understood: a time capsule of truth. Technicians from the State Forensic Lab in Harrisburg began the delicate process of extracting DNA from the decades-old material. The sample was degraded, fragile, like trying to read an old photograph through broken glass. But by 1997, after months of testing, they succeeded. A single, complete male DNA profile emerged. For the first time in 22 years, the investigation had something tangible, not rumor, not memory, but the genetic fingerprint of Lindy's killer. Stevens entered the information into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database established by the FBI to connect crime scene DNA with known offenders. Across America, the system had already begun solving old cases, linking murderers and rapists to crimes they thought were forgotten. CODIS was, in theory, the great equalizer. A silent witness that never aged, never forgot, never lied. So Stevens waited. Each week he'd check the database, hoping for that match, the alert that would blink on his screen like a miracle. But none came. Months passed. Then years. The DNA belonged to someone who had never been caught. It was both a victory and a heartbreak. They now knew the killer's genetic code, could map every sequence of his existence, and yet they still had no name, no face. The science had given them a whisper of truth, but not a voice. By 2000, the case had returned to its long sleep. The evidence remained stored in climate-controlled vaults, waiting for another breakthrough. Detective Stevens kept a framed copy of Lindy's high school photo on his desk. Each December 5th, he'd light a candle beside it and reread Hayes's old note. Someday science will tell us what we can't yet see. He never stopped believing it. Meanwhile, outside the police station, the world kept changing. Computers replaced typewriters. Cell phones replaced payphones. But inside the cold case unit, time moved differently, measured not in hours or years, but in advances. The early 2000s brought faster DNA sequencing and improved matching algorithms. Samples that had once taken months to test could now be analyzed in weeks. Entire databases expanded, adding offenders from every state. Thousands of cases across America found closure, some after 30, even 40 years. Families who had long since given up hope suddenly received phone calls that began with the words, "We found him." 8s, but not the Becklers. In Lancaster County, the DNA profile still sat in the CODIS system, silent, no match, no movement. The code existed like a ghost, a digital fingerprint floating in the void, belonging to a man who had either died, disappeared, or lived quietly among his neighbors. For the surviving family, the decades had aged their grief into something quieter, but no less sharp. Robert Beckler had passed away in 1998, never knowing the truth. Margaret followed in 2004, her obituary making brief mention of a daughter gone too soon. David, now middle-aged, had children of his own and a determination that the case would not be forgotten. He began attending state hearings about forensic funding, writing letters to officials, demanding that DNA technology be fully utilized. "If we can find the truth for my sister," he said, "we can find it for others too." 8s. By 2010, forensic genealogy was emerging, a new branch of investigation combining DNA science with family tree research. Investigators could now compare genetic data from crime scenes with publicly available genealogy websites to find relatives of suspects, even if the suspects themselves had never been arrested. The process was controversial, but effective. The Golden State Killer case in California had just proven it could work. A serial killer identified through the DNA of a distant relative. For cold case detectives across America, it was a revelation. In Lancaster County, the old Beckler file was once again pulled from the shelf. Detective Sarah Morrison, who now led the cold case division, studied the faded reports with fresh eyes. She had grown up in Pennsylvania and remembered hearing about Lindy's murder as a child, her parents whispering about that poor girl on Barbara Street. Eights. When Morrison reviewed the preserved DNA profile, she saw what Stevens and Hayes had only dreamed of. A new possibility. If they could use genetic genealogy, maybe, just maybe, they could find the man behind the code. But genealogy searches required resources, time, and cooperation from specialized labs. The process wasn't cheap. She began reaching out to national partners, companies like Parabon Nanolabs, known for pioneering the technology that turned anonymous DNA into family trees. She didn't know it yet, but she was setting in motion the final act of the story, one that would reach back across nearly 5 decades to reveal a killer hiding in plain sight. In the sterile hum of her office, Morrison wrote her first note into the reopened file. 8. DNA profile preserved. Request funding for genealogical analysis. 8. And as she closed the folder, the camera of time seemed to zoom out, from her desk, to the hallway lined with case photos, to the cold Pennsylvania night beyond. The snow was falling again, just as it had in 1975. The same town. The same silence. But this time, the silence wouldn't last forever. In the archives of America's cold case files, hope often waits in silence. By the early 2020s, the science of DNA had evolved from miracle to routine, but what came next would redefine forensic investigation entirely. It was no longer just about matching a suspect's DNA to a crime scene. Now, investigators could identify a killer through his family tree, tracing ancestry the same way genealogists trace lineage. The science had become personal. In Lancaster County, Detective Sarah Morrison had been following the rise of this new field, genetic genealogy, with fascination. She'd watched in 2018 as the world learned about the Golden State Killer, caught after 40 years because of a distant relative who had uploaded DNA to a public genealogy site. It was a revolution, one that blurred the line between family history and criminal justice. By 2021, she decided it was time to bring that revolution to Manor Township. The cold case file of Lindy Sue Beckler, now nearly half a century old, still contained one perfect piece of biological evidence, the killer's genetic code, preserved through time like a frozen confession. Morrison reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, the Virginia-based company leading the frontier of forensic genealogy. Their team, led by C.C. Moore, had become famous for solving impossible cases. C.C. wasn't a cop or a scientist in the traditional sense. She was a genetic genealogist, someone who could take strands of DNA and weave them into family trees that stretched across generations. She had helped adoptees find biological parents and families reunite with long-lost relatives. Now, she was helping detectives find killers. When Moore received the Beckler sample, she recognized its potential immediately. The DNA was old but intact, a near-perfect genetic map of a man who had escaped justice since 1975. The process began with phenotyping, predicting physical traits from DNA. Parabon's advanced software rendered a digital composite based solely on genetics. A white male, likely of Southern European, Italian ancestry, dark hair, brown eyes, medium build. The model showed a man in his early 20s in 1975. The results were chilling in their ordinariness. A face so typical it could have belonged to anyone in Pennsylvania. Cece stared at the computer screen and thought, he's the kind of man who could disappear in plain sight. From there, the work shifted to genealogy, building the family tree backward through generations. Cece uploaded the genetic data to public databases used for ancestry research, searching for shared DNA segments among distant relatives. The system began to hum with connections. Third cousins, great-grandparents, distant branches leading to immigrant families who had arrived from Italy in the early 1900s. One surname kept reappearing across different branches, Sinopoli. She traced the name through Ellis Island immigration records, cross-referencing ship manifests and Pennsylvania census data. The Sinopoli family had settled in Lancaster County generations earlier, part of a close-knit Italian-American community. As the tree filled out, Cece began to move forward in time, narrowing the field from hundreds of names to just a few living male descendants. Her work required patience and intuition. Genetic genealogy wasn't about instant answers. It was about pattern recognition, understanding how DNA inheritance intersected with geography, culture, and time. Each match, each record, was a breadcrumb leading her closer to the truth. When she overlaid the final branches of the family tree with known addresses in Lancaster County, one name sat at the intersection of proximity, ancestry, and age. David Sinopoli, born 1952. He would have been 23 years old when Lindy was murdered. The perfect age, the perfect ancestry, the perfect location. He wasn't in CODIS because he had never been arrested. He had lived an entirely ordinary life, married, employed, respected. Exactly the kind of man no one would suspect. Cece flagged the result for Morrison, noting the near-perfect alignment of DNA inheritance patterns. "He fits everything," she wrote in her report. Italian ancestry, correct generation, Lancaster County residence, likely source of sample. Eights. When Morrison read those words, the air seemed to leave the room. After nearly 47 years, the faceless killer finally had a name. But knowing the name wasn't proof. They needed one more step, a modern, undeniable confirmation that would hold up in the court. And so, the plan began to take shape. Quiet surveillance, patient observation, and the collection of a single discarded object that would decide the case once and for all. Because in the world of cold case files, every great revelation begins not with an arrest, but with a single, microscopic strand of DNA. Top of form. Bottom of form. Detective Sarah Morrison sat in her unmarked car outside a modest, two-story home in Lancaster County. The sun was just beginning to rise, turning the frost on the rooftops gold. It was February 2022, 47 years since the night Lindy Sue Beckler had been murdered, and the world around that house had changed in every way except one. The man inside had never been caught. David Sinopoli, 70 years old, lived quietly with his wife in a neighborhood where everyone still waved at passing cars. To his neighbors, he was the kind of man who fixed his own gutters, mowed his lawn every Saturday, and smiled politely at church. But to Morrison and her team, he was the prime suspect in one of Pennsylvania's oldest unsolved murders. For weeks, investigators had tracked his movements. They knew his schedule down to the minute. 7:15 a.m. He left home for work. 7:25, a stop at the same Dunkin' Donuts on Fruitville Pike. Medium coffee, black. He always sat by the window, reading the local paper before heading to his maintenance job. The routine never changed, not once. The surveillance team called it the loop. Eights. They just needed one thing, his DNA. Under current law, they couldn't compel a sample without cause, but they could collect anything he discarded in public. A cup, a napkin, a straw, anything that touched his lips. Morrison's voice over the radio was calm but steady. Eyes on Sinopoli. Wait for the cup. Eights. Inside the shop, David sat alone, same as every morning. He looked ordinary, gray hair neatly combed, glasses sliding down his nose, the steam of his coffee rising like the last traces of innocence. He read quietly, occasionally glancing at the TV above the counter, oblivious to the two plainclothes officers sitting behind him. You sip your morning coffee, never knowing it will end a 47-year secret. He finished the cup in 20 minutes, crumpled it, and dropped it in the trash before heading out. The door chimed. Morrison gave the signal. Within seconds, Detective Maria Santos, leading the surveillance team, slipped on gloves and retrieved the discarded cup using sterile tongs. She sealed it in an evidence bag marked with the date and time. February 12th, 2022, Dunkin' Donuts, Lancaster County. The bag was placed in a portable cooler and driven directly to the Pennsylvania State Forensic Laboratory. No fanfare. No cameras. Just quiet determination. For the next 3 weeks, the lab worked in silence. Every technician who touched that cup knew what it represented, the potential end of a half-century nightmare. They extracted saliva from the rim, isolated the genetic material, and began the comparison. The computer algorithm processed the data overnight, line by line, base by base, ancient DNA from a crime scene meeting, modern evidence from a coffee cup. The report was finalized early the next morning. The match probability, greater than 99%. When the call came, Morrison was sitting at her desk, reviewing old photographs from the 1975 investigation. She stared at the phone for a second before answering. "Detective Morrison," the voice said, "we have your man." Eights. Silence followed, the kind that only comes after decades of waiting. She looked at the photo of Lindy Sue taped above her desk, 19 years old forever, and whispered, "We got him, Lindy." Eights. News of the DNA match spread through the department like electricity. Officers who hadn't even been born when the murder happened stopped to read the report, shaking their heads in disbelief. David Sinopoli, the friendly neighbor, the churchgoer, the man who'd lived quietly for nearly 50 years, had been hiding a monster's secret behind a normal life. Morrison authorized the arrest plan immediately. It would be quiet, respectful, no theatrics. After all, he wasn't running anymore. He'd stopped looking over his shoulder decades ago. The next morning, as the winter sun rose again over Lancaster County, police cars lined Maple Avenue. Morrison approached the garage where Sinopoli was working on his lawnmower. He looked up, confused but calm. "David Sinopoli," she said, voice steady. "You're under arrest for the murder of Lindy Sue Beckler." "A's." He didn't protest. He didn't ask why. He simply exhaled, lowered his head, and whispered something no one could quite hear. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was resignation. As officers led him to the car, neighbors gathered on their porches, mouths open in disbelief. The friendly man next door, the one who had lived among them for 47 years, was the killer they had all feared but stopped believing in. For the detectives, the moment was surreal. Justice had finally arrived, not in a gunfight, not in a confession, but in a discarded coffee cup. And in the long history of America's cold case files, that simple, ordinary object would become one of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence ever found. The morning of July 15th, 2022, began like any other in Lancaster County, birds chirping, sprinklers clicking to life, the smell of cut grass drifting across Maple Avenue. But that quiet summer air was about to be ripped open. At precisely 8:42 m. Detective Sarah Morrison's voice came over the police radio. All units in position. Proceed. 8s. 3 unmarked cars rolled slowly up the street. Neighbors watering their lawns barely noticed until they saw the flash of badges and the glint of handcuffs. Moments later, officers walked calmly up the driveway of a small beige house with blue shutters, the home of the David Sinopoli, age 70. He was in his garage, as usual, repairing a leaf blower, wearing a white undershirt smeared with grease. When the detectives entered, he didn't flinch. He looked up at Morrison, recognized her from the week before when she'd posed as a city inspector, and simply said, "You finally found me, didn't you?" 8s. Morrison nodded, her voice steady but low. "David Sinopoli, you're under arrest for the murder of Lindy Sue Beckler, December 5th, 1975. 8s. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Sinopoli didn't resist. He placed the screwdriver down gently, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned around for the cuffs. His face was blank, drained of all color. If there was fear, it was buried beneath decades of practiced calm. From the porch, his wife Carol stepped out in a robe, confusion tightening her expression. "David, what's going on?" 8s. The officer stayed professional, reading him his rights while neighbors began to gather across the street. Someone recorded on a phone. Someone else whispered, "That's him? That's the guy?" 8s. Carol's voice cracked. There must be some mistake. 8s. But there wasn't. Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle yet firm. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We have conclusive DNA evidence." 8s. Carol looked from the detective to her husband, the man she'd shared a home, a bed, a life with for 40 years. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You told me you didn't even know her." 8s. He said nothing. He just kept his eyes on the ground as the handcuffs clicked into place. As officers guided him down the driveway, cameras from local news crews arrived, sirens wailing in the distance. Morrison watched as the garage door slowly closed behind them, shutting out half a century of lies. Across the street, neighbor Bill Morrison, no relation to the detective, stood frozen, Jose still running, water pooling at his feet. "I've lived next to that man for 30 years, he muttered. "He shoveled my driveway every winter." 8s. Another neighbor added. "He helped fix our fence last summer. My God, he came to our barbecue." 8s. In the police car, Sinopoli sat silent, staring straight ahead. Through the rear window, his reflection overlapped with the small, tree-lined street he'd walked for decades. Somewhere in that reflection was the 23-year-old man he'd once been, the man who had stepped into Lindy Sue's apartment with a knife and left with her life. As the car turned the corner, a montage seemed to play out in the mind's eye. 8s. Sinopoli at Sunday Mass, shaking hands with the priest. Sinopoli at the local fair, eating funnel cake beside his wife. Sinopoli cheering at Little League games, blending seamlessly into the background of ordinary life. Each memory was a lie he'd worn like a mask, each smile a thread in a 47-year deception. At the Lancaster County Police Headquarters, reporters crowded behind barricades as the patrol car pulled in. Flashbulbs exploded, capturing his blank expression, the face of a man who had fooled an entire town. Inside, Morrison signed the final line of the arrest report. She exhaled, not with triumph, but with quiet disbelief. "He's been here all along," she said softly. "For 47 years, The people of Manor Township had lived with a ghost. That morning, they discovered the ghost had been mowing his lawn right next door. Shock rippled through Lancaster County like an earthquake because sometimes the monsters you fear most aren't strangers in the dark. They're the people you thought you knew. The courtroom in Lancaster County Courthouse was silent, the kind of silence that feels like held breath. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of decades of waiting. On one side sat the Beckler family, older now, faces marked by time and loss. On the other, the man who had stolen everything from them, David Sinopoli, 71 years old, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and wireframe glasses that slipped down his nose. It was October 19th, 2023, the day justice finally spoke. Sinopoli shuffled into the courtroom, flanked by two deputies. His gait was slow, deliberate. The strong young man who had once wielded a knife with cold precision was now frail, gray, trembling slightly as he took his seat. Reporters filled the back rows. Photographers raised their cameras, capturing a face that looked more like an elderly grandfather than a killer. But behind those tired eyes lay 47 years of silence. Judge David Ashworth entered. "This court is now in session," he announced, voice echoing off the high ceilings. The words struck like a drumbeat, final, undeniable. When the charges were read, third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary, Sinopoli kept his eyes fixed on the floor. The prosecutor summarized the case. The preserved DNA, the genetic genealogy breakthrough, the discarded coffee cup that had ended a half-century of doubt. Each fact landed like a hammer, forging truth out of memory. Then came the moment everyone had waited for. "Mr. Sinopoli," the judge said, "how do you plead?" "Eights." The room held its breath. Sinopoli swallowed hard, fingers trembling against the wooden table. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a cracked whisper barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights, he said the word that closed 47 years of questions. Guilty. Eights. It wasn't shouted or sobbed, it was surrendered. A single syllable heavy enough to collapse decades of speculation. Margaret and Robert Beckler were gone, but their children were there. David Beckler, now in his late 60s, gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles went white. His sister Susan Martinez pressed a tissue to her lips, tears spilling silently. They had dreamed of this day and dreaded it all the same. Sinopoli spoke again, voice quivering. I'm sorry. For what I did. For what I took. For the pain I caused." His eyes flickered toward the family for the first time, and in that brief glance, 47 years of guilt seemed to surface. Whether it was remorse or relief, no one could tell. The prosecutor didn't respond. There were no words adequate for the gravity of what he'd done. Judge Ashworth's gavel came down. "You are hereby sentenced to 25 to 50 years in state prison." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, not of outrage, but of release. The kind that comes when a wound finally closes, even if the scar remains. David Beckler exhaled, whispering to no one in particular, "It's over, Lindy. It's finally over." Eights. Sinopoli was led away in handcuffs, shoulders hunched, head bowed. The door closed behind him with a metallic click, the sound of justice arriving half a century late. For the Becklers, it wasn't triumph. It was something quieter. Catharsis. The truth had finally spoken, and for the first time since that winter night in 1975, the silence didn't feel so heavy. When the cell door closed behind David Sinopoli, Lancaster County exhaled for the first time in 47 years. Yet even as justice settled over the community, a haunting question lingered. Why? What drives an ordinary man, a neighbor, a husband, a churchgoer, to commit such savage violence and then live half a lifetime pretending it never happened? Psychologists call it the banality of evil, the terrifying truth that darkness can hide beneath the most unremarkable faces. Sinopoli wasn't a drifter or a career criminal. He was a man who paid his taxes, volunteered at church picnics, smiled at children playing on the sidewalk. Evil didn't look like a monster in the dark. It looked like the man who waved at you from his driveway. Experts who reviewed the case later suggested that Sinopoli's attack may have been fueled by impulse and control, a dangerous mix of sexual frustration, rage, and opportunity. The towel wrapped around the knife handle showed forethought, the act of someone calculating even in chaos. But his life afterward revealed something more chilling: the ability to compartmentalize. He buried the memory so deeply that he could build a new life right above the grave of his old one. How does someone live with a secret like that for nearly half a century? Perhaps by convincing himself it never happened. By folding guilt into routine, coffee every morning, mass every Sunday, a smile every evening, until the lie becomes muscle memory. The kind of man who tells himself, it was just one night, it's gone now. But the truth never dies. It only waits. And in this case, it waited for science. When detectives in 1975 preserved that single biological sample, they were preserving the future. Every generation of investigators built upon the last. Hayes with his meticulous notes, Stevens with his early DNA testing, Morrison with her trust in genetic genealogy. Together, they proved that justice doesn't expire. It evolves. The story of Lindy Sue Beckler became more than a tragedy. It became a testament to perseverance, to the quiet heroism of investigators who refused to give up. A reminder that even when memory fades and evidence grows cold, truth remains embedded in tissue, in time, in DNA. Science had become the voice for the voiceless. And for the first time since that cold night in 1975, that voice had spoken, clear, undeniable, and finally, at peace. Winter returned to Lancaster County the following year, just as it had so many times before, soft snow drifting over Barbara Street, the same quiet peace that had once hidden something unspeakable. But now, that silence felt different. It wasn't heavy with fear anymore. It was peaceful, almost sacred. At Conestoga Memorial Park, a small headstone sat beneath a bare oak tree, dusted with snow. The name carved in stone read Lindy Sue Beckler, 1956 to 1975. For decades, this place had been a monument to grief, a wound that refused to heal. But now, after nearly half a century, it had become a monument to truth. On a gray December afternoon, David Beckler stood there with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the cold air. His hair was white now, his back slightly bent, but his promise, the one he made as a young man beside this same grave, had finally been kept. He placed a single white rose on the headstone. "We found him, Lindy," he said softly. "He can't hurt anyone else now." Eights. For the first time, those words didn't feel like wishful thinking. They felt real. In the distance, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint sound of church bells. The same church that had once overflowed with mourners at her funeral now held Sunday services again, filled with families who no longer whispered about monsters hiding in their midst. The town had changed. Fear had given way to quiet healing. Detective Sarah Morrison visited the grave soon after. She stood silently, remembering the hundreds of hours spent piecing together fragments of the past, reports written by men long retired, evidence tagged before she was even born. This was why she joined the force. Not for fame, not for numbers, but for this: to return a name to a crime and peace to a family that had carried pain longer than most people live. The media called the case a triumph of science, but for those closest to it, it was something deeper. It was proof that truth can survive decades of silence, that justice can cross generations, that even in the coldest of cold case files, there is always a heartbeat waiting to be heard again. Across Lancaster County, people began to speak of Lindy differently. No longer just the girl who died, but the woman whose story changed everything. Her name became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of perseverance. At the police department, the Beckler file, once a source of frustration, was now displayed in the cold case office as a reminder. Never close the book too soon. And pinned to the wall above it was Hayes's handwritten note from 1975. Preserve everything. Someday science will tell us what we can't yet see. 8. Someday had finally come. Night falls again over Manor Township. Streetlights flicker on, just like they did that night in 1975. Families gather for dinner. The sidewalks are quiet, the air still. A small town finally rests. But somewhere, beneath the hum of ordinary life, there's an awareness, a lesson carved into collective memory. You think you know your neighbors. You think your town is safe. But how well do you really know the faces you pass each morning? Because for 47 years, the man who killed Lindy Sue Beckler lived among them, unseen, unpunished, a ghost in plain sight. And yet, in the end, truth found him. Not through luck, not through rumor, but through science, patience, and the unyielding faith that justice, no matter how delayed, will always arrive. The camera pans one last time to Lindy's grave, the snow still falling softly over her name. If this were your town, could you ever sleep the same again? Subscribe and share this story, because in the world of cold case files, every truth deserves its day in the light.